Newfoundland and Labrador has an aging population. In the last census, nearly 20% of the population was 65 years of age or older. The graying of our province is something we've been talking about for quite some time and will continue to do so. Increasingly more of the labor force here is also over the age of 65, as more people choose or indeed have to work beyond this age. And we know that our municipal sector is also aging. Despite a strong discourse on aging, and perhaps an even stronger one over the years on youth out-migration, particularly from rural areas, there are a lot of young people here, and they are doing good things for and with their communities. As municipalities across the province head into an election year, and as we look to young people to step up in their communities, we have to ask, where are young people at right now, here, especially in a pandemic? Here to tell us more about this is Jen Crowe. Jen is the Strategic Initiatives Coordinator for Choices for Youth, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping youth secure stable housing, education, and employment. As coordinator, Jen leads the organization's policy, advocacy, and provincial expansion work. She's passionate about youth engagement, municipal politics, and public policy, and is currently serving as chair of Happy City St. John's, a nonprofit organization focused on municipal civic engagement. In the early spring, Choices for Youth launched a survey on the impacts of COVID on young people in this province. Jen will dig into the results from that survey here, and following her presentation, she and I will sit down for a conversation on what these findings mean, or could mean, for youth participation in their communities, especially in the arena of municipal politics. And we'll find out what else we might need to glean from these findings as we look to the years ahead for municipalities. Thank you, Jen, for joining us today. We're certainly looking forward to the conversation.
Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Jen Crowe, Strategic Initiatives Coordinator with Choices for Youth. I want to thank the Municipalities NL team for having me here today and for making this conference happen despite all things COVID. Thanks so much for making this work. Before I begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has now been erased forever. I also want to acknowledge the island of Newfoundland as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And I want to acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatukavut. We recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the generations to come. As First Peoples here have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in the spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. So today, I'm really excited to be here to present to you some of the results from a recent consultation process that Choices for Youth underwent. Before I get started with some of those results, I just want to quickly share that the discussions today may include topics such as homelessness, poverty, hunger, sex work, and mental health. So if you're gathered today in a space, I certainly encourage you to step out if you need to and return at any time. Finally, I really want to thank all the young people who shared their experiences with us and whose experiences I'm privileged to share with you today. I also want to extend a thank you to all the staff people across Newfoundland and Labrador working directly with young people who helped make the survey and consultation process possible. Thank you so much. So I want to provide a little bit of information about Choices for Youth before we get into some of those results. So Choices for Youth is a nonprofit organization that is focused in St. John's and is in the process of provincially expanding some of its services. It was founded in response to youth housing needs with the closure of Mount Cashel in 1990, and it currently serves 1,600 young people a year with the goal of supporting youth and young families to secure stable housing, education, and employment through innovative programming and social enterprises, while working towards family stability and better health. So today there's a few things that I'm hoping to cover. First of all, I'll start off by sharing a little bit about the impact that Choices for Youth saw during COVID-19 and how it affected the young people that we worked with. I'll also share a little bit about why we underwent a consultation process and the process that we followed in doing so. Next, I'll share a little bit about what we heard directly from young people and the key themes that we think are so important now and well into the future. Finally, I'll focus on solutions. What are the key solutions that we heard directly from young people that we think will make meaningful change now and well into the future for our youngest and most vulnerable populations? And finally, I'll share some final thoughts before we head into a discussion. So what is it that Choices for Youth observed at the beginning of COVID-19? I'm sure if there's folks in the space today who have experience working with young people, this will not be particularly unusual for you. So first of all, we saw a huge spike in the demand for meal services through Choices for Youth. So, normally we do meal services every single day through our outreach center, but the numbers just went up and up. And we also saw a changing demographic of folks who actually needed access to our services. That included post-secondary students. It included folks from across the world who were needing to avail of our services, certainly a changing demographic, and certainly more students. We also saw massive education and employment disruption, which led to a housing disruption. So we saw young people who all of a sudden had to do online learning, which for whatever reason perhaps wasn't working for them. It also led to young people who we know oftentimes are employed in the services sector who lost one or all of their jobs. And this resulted in them not being able to afford perhaps the places where they were currently renting close to their key services. And all of this meant that we saw an increase in mental health challenges. So as young people faced isolation, March into April, into May and June, and they also faced the challenges of access to childcare while home all day with their children, we really saw a spike in all kinds of mental health concerns, which we knew needed to be addressed immediately. So what did we do about this? Like many organizations, we immediately felt like we needed to change our program delivery. So the meals that we were able to serve to young people in our outreach space, now all of a sudden we were doing delivery only. We also had to modify our approach in terms of our staffing. So Choices for Youth operates 3 social enterprises, and while all those young people could not work during COVID-19, they continued to stay employed, and we knew that they were being challenged while being isolated at home by themselves. We also recognized that safety was paramount for all of our staff members, and so we had to change the way that we operated as first-line responders in spaces, ensuring that there was appropriate PPE during a global shortage of PPE, and also ensuring that staff members were safe and comfortable still working with young people during this time. Ultimately, we were getting the sense that there were a lot of challenges that young people were experiencing right now, but also that those challenges weren't going to stop anytime soon. As our province went into lockdown through April and May, we continued to see the mounting challenges that young people were experiencing, and we knew that something had to be done. So what did we do? So in late April of 2020, Choices for Youth undertook a process of consulting as many young people as we possibly could on how COVID-19 had impacted them. While we were receiving anecdotal information, certainly through our own services, but also through our partners, that young people were struggling right now, we wanted to hear it directly from young people in terms of what they were experiencing and what they needed right now. So who did we hear from through this process? We heard from 486 young people in the ages of 16 to 29 right across Newfoundland and Labrador. That included folks in most major regions across the province. We also heard from folks through both an online survey, a paper survey, and through consultation. So we actually held consultations in every major region across Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as with students, to try to get a sense of, we're hearing these things through our survey, but what else? And what are the opportunities? What are the solutions that you would like to see championed? If you could share your thoughts with decision makers in our province. We also heard from, a relatively even split across youth populations, and we certainly heard from a lot of students, but we also heard a lot from vulnerable populations through specifically our paper survey. So the types of young people that we heard from, it was actually pretty striking how many of them were unemployed. So 61% of the young people that we heard from in late April until early June were unemployed. And when we asked them why they were unemployed, 72% of them said that it was due to COVID-19. 17% of the respondents that we heard from had dependents, which was a pretty striking statistic, acknowledging the particular challenges of women who have children during COVID. And about 14% of respondents identified as being a person with a disability. We also heard from Indigenous young people and New Canadians, with about 10% of those who we heard from being Indigenous, and 8% being a New Canadian in our province. So I want to share a little bit about what we heard from this process. There were really 5 key themes here, and I'm going to dig into those first 4. So the first one was around mental health. So we heard from young people that, one of the major challenges that they were experiencing, and you can see the many things that we asked them about there. We certainly heard about educational pursuits and we heard about leisure and self-care, but overwhelmingly we heard about mental health and how this pandemic was affecting their mental well-being. So 67% of the young people that we surveyed indicated that their mental health had been impacted as a consequence of COVID-19. In terms of why it had been impacted, we heard a lot about fear, uncertainty. We heard that, now that education is all online, I'm not really sure what my goals are going to look like. I don't know when I'm going to be back in school. We talked about people not having their social circles and their supports around them. We heard about childcare. We heard about employment. And one interesting thing that we heard was around, the future of their employment as well, around, understanding that folks were not able to actually go back to work right now, but what that would mean for them into the future, and specifically for young people who are just at the start of their career, what it could mean for the sustainability of their chosen sector. We also heard a lot about poverty. So this is an interesting question around how young people feel about the NL economy now compared to before the pandemic. So we heard that 79% of young people felt worse about the economy now than they did before the pandemic. We also heard from 77% of young people who felt that the pandemic would actually impact their earning potential 6 months into the future or longer. So certainly a lot of fear there around what it would mean. And I think, important to understand that in the context of young people who are perhaps trying to get that next work term or that volunteer opportunity or that entry-level position, and understanding if those things don't fall into place in the next 6 months or the next year, what that could mean for their long-term future and what that can mean for their earning potential. This is one quote that I wanted to share with folks. One of the benefits of doing the consultation and the consultation process as well as the survey is that we heard some really impactful things from young people. So this one is, I moved in with my friends once bubbles were allowed because I could no longer afford to live on my own due to COVID. I've placed my educational goals on standby due to financial reasons, and my mental health has been all over the place due to stress and fear. So that was a quote that I wanted to share because I think it really captures the experiences of so many young people throughout the pandemic. So no surprise here, but young people are experiencing major setbacks. This one here around which of the following words describes how you feel about your employment or career aspirations. And we can see there how many young people feel so uncertain or worried about their career goals or educational aspirations. So we heard that 53% of young people shared that their employment goals or career aspirations have changed due to COVID-19. We also heard that 50% have experienced a change in their educational goals since the pandemic. So, young people are incredibly resilient, and especially when we're looking at vulnerable young people, they're constantly responding to their environment. So, in the midst of a global pandemic, if there's uncertainty about whether or not what their educational pursuits are, if there will be a job for them at the end of it, we heard from lots of young people who said, I'm thinking of just changing it. I'm thinking of maybe dropping out, or I'm thinking of trying to get a job where I can make money now because I'm just so uncertain about the future, particularly in the province. And then the last one there is around young people struggling to access education. So we heard from 77% of young people who shared uncertainty or worry about their educational goals. And this was really interesting because, I mentioned already around the kind of educational goals and pursuing educational goals and how that aligns with career, but we also heard so much around digital access. So for young people who were perhaps forced to move back to their rural or remote community as things shut down at the university, or high school students who were living in rural and remote communities already, they're challenged by lack of access to broadband internet, lack of reliable data, and in some cases just lack of infrastructure. If there's multiple children in a household, it's unlikely that each of them has a tablet or a computer. So we heard a lot about just being unable to access education as it was currently being presented, and how much of a barrier that is to a young person who's already feeling isolated away from their support system. So this is one quote that we heard from a young person around education. So if COVID-19 is still going on and come September we cannot be in the classroom, then I'll be taking a year off until I can attend a classroom again, which puts me back at least a year. So again, kind of drawing on this idea of, what does it mean to be put back a year when you're 18 or 19 or 20, and how that could look different for older adults. And we know that it's really high impact, and we know that young people are particularly vulnerable when it comes to economic crises, and certainly a global pandemic like what we're experiencing now. So it's not all bleak, of course. We did hear lots and lots of really interesting solutions from young people. So one of the questions that we asked young people during our survey process was, if you could say one thing to decision makers right now, what would it be? And this is really what we heard in terms of what it is that they need, centered around these 4 themes that I'll dig into a little bit more deeply. Go back one. So the first one that we heard was around broadening access to youth mental health and wellness resources. So what does that look like? We heard a lot about the need for both virtual care and regional mental health hubs. I think that what's really interesting about this pandemic for young people is it's certainly drawn out, the power and potential of virtual learning, of virtual work, but also the many challenges that comes with that. So we heard from young people that they both want to see people face to face and be able to access mental health and counseling that way, but also have the option of being able to access it virtually. Specifically, if you're in rural and remote communities, of course, barring that they have adequate infrastructure to access it. The third one that we had there, which, it's perhaps an interesting draw that it's under the mental health and wellness piece there, is around access to a universal basic income. So we heard from young people who were able to really identify that this is what they need right now. For those youth who could access CERB, they spoke about how it was really, really helpful for them in navigating a very difficult time. For those young people who accessed it, and for those who couldn't, we heard that something like this needs to be put in place more permanently. And that was specifically because a young person who's navigating transition out of high school to perhaps a post-secondary program or even the workforce, it can take months for them to find that job. And as they're pursuing education, it can be incredibly expensive. So we heard a lot from young people about the ramifications, the financial consequences of this pandemic and how it was affecting their educational and employment choices. But if there was something like a universal basic income, how that would really provide them with the financial stability to navigate these challenging times. The next thing that we heard from was around the need to reduce barriers to youth labor market attachment. So we heard a lot about the value of social enterprises or a supportive educational network for young people. So at Choices for Youth, we run 3 social enterprises, and we were able to continue to operate the youth employment side of it during COVID-19. And this was largely because part of the bottom line with social enterprises is around supporting people and supporting employees. So we heard a lot about the value and the potential of that, specifically in more rural and remote communities where there's not a lot of employment opportunities for young people. We also heard a lot about the limitations of the current income support system. So I'll share a quote later on from a young person on income support, but certainly we heard about the injustices in terms of how much a young person was making on income support versus CERB, but also the limitations for a young person on income support looking to transition into the workforce while maintaining their income support benefits. So one of the things that Choices for Youth has certainly proposed and that we heard directly from young people too was being able to open up more employment opportunities and more employment hours for young people who were on income support to better ensure that they had the supports and the resources they needed to thrive through employment. And the last one there is around rethinking employment training. So one of the things that we heard a lot from young people was, I've been laid off and I just don't think I'm going to get a job back with that company. It's kind of the first in, first out process that many of us have heard of. So how do we actually create that attachment to the labor force for young people? One of the ways that we feel is very necessary at Choices for Youth is through employment training. So being able to offer young people, 21st century skill development, that soft skill development that can actually transition them from one career to another, but also provide them with mentorship opportunities through the labor force so that, if they're looking for employment or they're looking for a new job once being laid off, they at least have connections through the labor force that they can draw on, which is something that, older adults certainly have more access to, and we know how important that is for landing those employment opportunities. The next one I'll share is around investing in community and family well-being. So one of the things that we heard from a lot is around the need for affordable childcare, and certainly the landscape has shifted a little bit in the past few weeks with the announcement of the $25 a day childcare. But this was a real major problem that so many young moms that we spoke to talked about, how they're so interested in pursuing education or a career, but they're really limited by the lack of affordable childcare options in urban regions and in rural and remote communities. So more access, more subsidies, and kind of widening that space of who is able to access affordable childcare was really important to the young people that we spoke with. We also heard about providing incentives for local and social purchasing and hiring. So this is specifically around being able to support companies and encouraging companies to buy from social enterprises, to buy from companies that are actually supporting young people, and really thinking about what that ecosystem of support could look like. The last one I want to share there is that we spoke to many young people who were back living in their community where perhaps their family was because, for example, they could no longer afford their student housing as things went online and as they lost some of their employment income. One of the things that we heard from them that was quite surprising was, they felt sad that they had to leave that urban landscape where many of their friends were, but they were also really happy to be with their family and certainly had a connection to the community where they grew up. So one of the things that we certainly heard loud and clear was the need to invest in affordable housing, certainly in urban centers, but also in rural and remote communities, so that if a young person is interested in staying in that community and working there or pursuing education, they have that option, and they have the option of living somewhere that's outside of their family home. The last theme that I'll speak to is around investing in youth learning and development. So one of the things that we heard about was young people just not having the infrastructure, the space, the desk, the private corner in a home to be able to learn and work from home. So we heard stories from young people who were sharing an apartment with 5 or 6 other roommates and were feeling like they were constantly confined to tiny room. They didn't have a desk. They were, experiencing back pains, all kinds of stuff. On the flip side, we also heard from young people who simply did not have the data or technology to access education or employment, and were really struggling in whatever community they were in. So one of the things that we heard directly from young people was it would be amazing if the province was able to support them in learning and working from home by having a subsidy that could provide them with a desk or appropriate lighting or a tablet or a laptop so that they could actually adequately learn and work from home. We also heard a lot about the need for high-speed internet, and I know that this is not a new conversation, but one that has certainly emerged throughout this pandemic as so many people are relying exclusively on internet to do what they need to do in terms of employment and education. So we certainly heard loud and clear from young people that they need strong investment in internet access, in data access, right across Newfoundland and Labrador, and also how much of a game changer that would be for them in terms of considering where they continue to pursue their education, but also thinking about where they continue to pursue their employment, specifically as opportunities come up increasingly with remote employment. So this is one quote that I want to share, and I think specifically speaks to the benefit of CERB, but also the challenges that young people are facing who can't access it. So when we're speaking to some of the most vulnerable young people who access our services and services right across Newfoundland and Labrador, this is a theme that we heard. So this one is specifically CERB versus income support is showing a degree of privilege and priority. People on income support are stereotyped and devalued, and that's why we got a lot less money. When I was on income support, I got $160 to $280 every 2 weeks, depending on whether I was on youth services or AESL. That wasn't enough for me, so I did sex work. Other people did drugs and did art, and when they did that, I didn't pay taxes on sex work. People who sell drugs don't pay taxes. So this is, of course, a really unfortunate reality in terms of young people having to pursue these types of employment to gain income. But I think it really highlights the reality of young people in that they are resourceful and that they do need to work hard in order to make the wage that they require. And ultimately, if they're not getting the support that they need through government systems, they're going to be looking to get that support elsewhere. So again, coming back to the idea of what does it look like to provide, universal basic income? What does it look like to provide a more comprehensive and transitional income support system for these young people who are really struggling now and were struggling before the pandemic? I think many of those gaps, certainly, we've seen them widen throughout COVID-19. So just a couple of final thoughts that I wanted to share with folks. Over the past couple of months, the pandemic has really forced us to focus on immediate needs and wrap our arms around the most vulnerable populations in our province. I'm speaking specifically about young people today, but that extends to our seniors, it extends to folks with disability, and it extends to newcomers, along with many other population groups. The purpose of this report is to shine a light on where youth need us to go from here. And I think that there's folks in this room, there's folks within the sector who are so eager and interested in supporting those young people. What I hope is that this report has provided us with a little bit of a roadmap in terms of how to do that. So in terms of how to access our report, I'd certainly encourage folks to check out choicesforyouth.ca/forwardtogether for a summary of the report and also our entire report, which outlines all the recommendations and the key findings from what we heard from young people. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you for that presentation, Jen. It's certainly a lot to think about and a lot to ponder. It certainly prompts a lot of questions for me from a municipal lens. You note at the beginning the importance of a youth-centered recovery. Mm-hmm. And the things that we see in your findings on youth food insecurity, poverty, mental health concerns, and a lack of access to key services and resources, it really paints a picture that we need to do more, especially now. And you also put forward some areas and suggestions for action, including reducing youth barriers to labor market attachment, investing in community and family well-being, and investing in youth learning and development. So when I think about all these things, I'm wondering, in your opinion, what is or could be the role for municipalities in those solutions?
Yeah, absolutely, Deirdre. I mean, I think that oftentimes when we think about these kind of systems levels problems, we often think about it's a provincial government or it's a federal government responsibility. But I actually think when it comes to COVID-19, the role of municipalities is absolutely critical. In Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, I mean, we heard from young people overwhelmingly who spoke to the fact that they actually wanted to live in the community where they were from, where they grew up, where they had connections to family and friends, but they had barriers to doing so. So, one of the things that I think we heard overwhelmingly was about displacement during the pandemic. And for some young people, that was, earth shattering and it was awful. And it meant moving from one area in an urban center where they were receiving supports to another area where they couldn't get those supports. But for other young people, it meant moving back to their rural or remote community outside of, in many cases, St. John's. And many young people spoke about how they actually really liked that they could be back with their family specifically during this difficult time, but that they didn't necessarily want to be spending the next few months or years living in their family home. So I think one of the things for municipalities is really finding ways to invest in affordable housing. What does that look like? And what does affordable housing look like specifically for young people? We know that that's often a really different dwelling structure than it is for adults and for families. So thinking about opportunities to invest in affordable apartments in, spaces where there's a couple different rooms and that kind of thing. So I think that's certainly one thing. I mean, the other piece that I think municipalities can really invest in is thinking about what is the attraction model for young people around employment. And where are there opportunities to invest in other economic development opportunities, but also really centering young people in that? So what are the employment opportunities that young people are looking for? Where are the businesses who are interested in supporting young people through employment and training? And really thinking about, where are those opportunities for expansion? Certainly that's something that we're doing right now and looking about how we can translate our social enterprise model to more rural and remote spaces. I think there's lots of opportunities for investment in that ecosystem. But certainly acknowledging that that is the type of employment that young people are looking for, where they can gain valuable skill sets, try out a bunch of different things, and ultimately come away with some great experience that they can lend to their next career opportunity.
Fascinating. Indeed, lots to think about. One of the things that we've talked about is even the municipal sector as a desirable place of work as well, and municipalities at the center of that, and enforcing work integrated learning. So I think there's a lot to take from that and spread it out around. We know that engaging youth in community is critical, and you've spoken to that. How do we engage youth as community leaders, whether in the municipal sector or otherwise, when they're faced with so many barriers? How can young people participate if they're experiencing poverty, if they have food insecurity, and if they lack access to key resources like childcare?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think one that we, by asking that question, I think we're on the right pathway. I often think about who is at our table and who is missing from that table. And ultimately, when we ask that question, we start to explore, well, how do we get the right people at the table? So if we think about vulnerable young people, for example, yes, it might not be accessible for them to be able to show up for a 7 to 8:30 meeting at a town hall. But if it's an issue that's pertaining to them, and so many local issues affect each and every one of us very profoundly and very individualistically, oftentimes they do want to be involved in the conversation. So I think we can think about all kinds of different methods for doing that. So if a vulnerable young person, if the place where they go for supports is a community youth network or another youth outreach center, then maybe there's an opportunity to be there and to have a quick conversation. What type of information can you gain from a young person in 5 to 10 minutes through a quick chat? The other thing that we've had really great success with is, if we're rolling out a lengthy survey and consultation processes, what is a version or variation of that, or even just changing the process slightly so that it could be answered easily by a vulnerable young person, or by a new Canadian, or by somebody who just has a very busy life. So I think about, is there an opportunity to shorten a survey so that it's a paper survey and you deliver it to people and you do it in exchange for a stipend or in exchange for a $5 gift card? That was a method that we took through the survey and consultation process, and it was very successful, and we got lots of people responding and interested and engaged and involved in the conversation. So I think sometimes it's little tweaks. It doesn't need to be anything groundbreaking. We can lean into social media. So if your current method of getting out information is through a media advisory or through a long post on Facebook, is there a way to take that and make it bite-sized and put it on as a story on Instagram or a series of quick tweets, you know? So I think, or an infographic, like there's lots of different ways to get that information out quickly, succinctly, so that it reaches those target populations. So I think, you know, one other thing that I would share is we heard a lot from young people through this process about, well, I want to hear about what happens with, you know, these things that I'm sharing with you. What's going to be the impact? Is it going to be heard by people? So, you know, the engagement process and making sure that you're looping back to those young people and that you're sharing that even if it was a meeting with a minister or a meeting with a mayor or a town council member, they want to hear about that and they want to hear about the impact of what it is that they're sharing. I think sometimes we lose sight of that in an engagement process. So looping back, closing that feedback loop, I think is really critical. And ultimately, I do think that young people want to be engaged in processes. It's just that they need to be engaged in a way that makes sense for them and their lives and the challenges that they're facing.
Some really good stuff there. Thanks. So that's actually a very good segue to my last and final question. You know, we talk a lot in the municipal sector about building the bridge from community engagement and leadership to municipal leadership. And based on the work that you're doing in Choices more broadly, and in the context of this survey, how can we build better bridges and make that building successful so that we do see more of these young people that you're talking about from diverse backgrounds and experiences on the ballot in election years?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question. And I think sometimes it just like takes a little bit of information sharing. You know, for me, for example, I got interested in municipal politics in part because I attended an MNL conference by fluke with a community organization I was working with a few years ago. But I think for many young people, they just don't know what is it that a counselor does? What is it that somebody who works for a municipality does? What are the options for me? So I think really putting emphasis on how do you communicate that, and again, leaning into those modes of communication that might look different for a young person versus an older adult, and really trying to get that information out there. I think the other really important story to tell is around, you know, the changing face, I think, of municipal politics a little bit. So, you know, I look at the Halifax municipal election that happened just a few days ago. The first Black female councillor got elected. And that, you know, was in addition to Lyndall Smith, who was the first Black male councillor in 26 years or something like that to be elected in Halifax. So I think things are shifting. In St. John's right now, we're seeing potentially the first transgendered woman councillor get elected in Ward 2. You know, I think we're seeing lots of more young people who are running, and that role modeling is so, so important. If you can see yourself in a position where you're the one, you know, somebody my age is doing council videos and someone who looks like me is out there and going door to door, then you can see yourself actually doing that as well. Those are the narratives and stories that we need to tell. And I think that once we got that information out there about what is it that a councillor does, what is it that a municipal employee does, and we can also show people, you know, this is somebody who looks like you, who's doing this work, and how impactful and profound can that work be. I think we're going to shift things, and I think it's already shifting, so the more we can lean into that, the more we can move with that, I think the better.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen, for your presentation, and thanks for these follow-up discussions afterwards.
Thanks for having me, Teotra.
Take care.